The idea of having a discussion about the Quincy family of Massachusetts originated this year after John Quincy Jr., who's speaking tonight, published his book, Quincy's Markets. His publisher, Northeastern University Press, suggested that he compile information about his family during the past 400 years as a possible series for PBS television. Tonight we will be the first to get a glimpse into the past of some of Mr. Quincy's ancestors and their contribution to early America. And the title of Mr. Quincy's lecture is The Quincy's of Massachusetts, one of America's oldest founding families. Please welcome John Quincy Jr.
Thank you very much. You know, the last time I spoke to a group, a guy came up to me afterwards and he said, Mr. Quincy, your speech was too long, too loud, and you didn't say a damn thing. The president of the organization overheard him, came up, and he said, oh, don't listen to him. He hasn't had an original idea in years. He just repeats what everyone else says. In 1875, Henry Adams, the grandson of President John Quincy Adams, remarked, the Quincys are, strictly speaking, an old family. They belong to the colonial aristocracy. When Abigail Adams accompanied her husband John to Great Britain in 1785, she preoccupied herself with genealogy. She personally searched the British archives, read the chronicles, and consulted the heralders, all of which convinced her that her maternal family had sprung from noble blood. The de Quincy family had crossed the English Channel from Normandy in 1066 with William the Conqueror and established themselves among the ruling Norman barons. Later, Richard Cranch, John Adams' brother-in-law, completed these genealogical labors at the bequest of the Quincy family of Massachusetts. Cranch reported that Robert de Quincy fought the Irish in the service of King Henry II and was a member of the High Court of Parliament. His son Roger de Quincy fought in the name of the Cross alongside Richard I and was a casualty of the Crusades in the Holy Land. He was followed by the first heirs to have title beginning with Sir William de Quincy, Earl of Winchester, who was among the barons that summoned King John to Runnymede in June 1215. Richard Cranch was also able to link the family crest to the Magna Carta. And though more than 4 centuries have rolled away, Cranch assured the family, yet the spirit has not been lost. Such revelations astounded Abigail Adams, who exclaimed, can it be wondered that I should wish to trace an ancestor among the signers of the Magna Carta? Today, the family spirit in America endures 12 generations after Puritan Edmund Quincy first settled in Massachusetts. Puritan Edmund Quincy was first sent to the New World in 1628 on a survey expedition for the Crown. While exploring the coastal environs, he became intrigued with the acreage south of the Neponset River surrounding Mount Wollaston. He immediately purchased 600 acres of the plantation from the Massachusetts Indians for 3 loaves of bread. Edmund returned to England and during the next 5 years dissolved his holdings and severed his English association. He later arrived in Boston with his wife Judith, 2 children, 6 servants, and disembarked at the town cove in the company of his close friend, Reverend John Cotton, on September 4th, 1633. Immediately, Edmund Quincy was elected to the Great and General Court of the province as one of its first representatives. The next year, the General Court elected Edmund to a committee to estimate the fair amount necessary to purchase the remainder of the Boston Peninsula from Reverend William Blackston. The rolling 44 acres was bought by the Puritans for the appraised sum of 30 pounds sterling and permanently kept open for animal grazing. This was the origin of Boston Common, the oldest public park in America. In 1636, land grants at Mount Wollaston were bounded out to Edmund Quincy and his business associate, William Coddington. The grants were extensive and encompassed several thousand acres. Edmund then moved his family into the wilderness, where he built a homestead on the south side of a river, now called Furnace Brook. However, problems for both men lay ahead. By 1637, the Bay Colony was deeply stirred by the dissensions of the antinomianian controversy, and Edmund's homestead became the meeting place of Anne Hutchinson, Coddington, Sir Harry Vane, and Reverend John Wheelwright. After Anne Hutchinson was banished from the colony, drastic action was taken against Coddington, Wheelwright, and Vane, who either fled to Rhode Island or back to England. Edmund Quincy had contracted consumption before the proceedings against him commenced. Otherwise, it is probable that he would have shared their exile. A year later, a wealthy Boston merchant named William King purchased Coddington's portion of the land grant. Edmund was still living in Braintree by 1640, so it is possible that between his close friendship with Reverend Cotton, his position as representative, and his contributions to that early society, that the Boston elders simply used his illness as an excuse not to banish him. He left one son, Edmund, and a daughter named Judith. Judith Quincy, the daughter, later married John Hull, the leading mintmaster and merchant of the Bay Colony. Point Judith, Rhode Island, is named for Judith Quincy. Or, as it was later said, for John Hull owned lands in the Narragansett country, and in giving names to those savage places, he conferred that of his wife on the ill-reputed headland, the pernicious promontory, the terror of all seasick passages, ever since known as Point Judith. The town of Hull, Massachusetts, was named for John Hull. Their daughter Hannah Hull later married Judge Samuel Sewell, and Hannah's weight was measured against her father's pine tree silver shillings as her dowry. The second Edmund never attended formal school, but was accorded those offices reserved for men of standing in the 17th century. He was named Justice, Representative, and Colonel of the Suffolk Militia. It was Edmund who his neighbors called upon whether to dispute a minor legal claim or to stop children from cutting down trees on Boston Common. In Braintree, he made a start on the stately family home that still stands today and is currently known as the Dorothy Quincy Homestead, named for his granddaughter, Dorothy, who became the great-grandmother of Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes. This Edmund preferred to be called Colonel Quincy because of his rank in the militia. But most importantly, Edmund is remembered as a member of the Council of Safety during the revolt against Governor Andros. Between Boston's founding in 1630 and the year 1686, Boston residents governed themselves by their own charter, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter. By 1686, it became evident that Bostonians were not His Majesty's most loyal subjects and could not be entrusted with the implements of war, such as the cannon at Fort Hill. The Crown revoked the colony's charter and sent Sir Edmund Andros to Boston as governor of His Majesty's Dominion of New England. Governor Andros held all the legislative powers, passing laws, acting as a judicial court, and levying taxes without the people's consent. In April 1689, tensions had grown so intense that the colonists converged upon the townhouse, backed by the Suffolk militia, and forced Andros from power. The leading men formed the Council of Safety and signed a declaration to preserve peace and orderly government. Edmund was one of these leading colonists, having commandeered the Suffolk militia. Not a shot had been fired, no one was injured or killed during Boston's first revolution. Decades later, many political leaders were judged by the parts they played or did not play in Andros's removal. As late as 1776, the Patriots referred to the incident as a justified resistance against an unlawful authority in defense of their traditional right of self-government. Edmund married twice. His first wife, Joanna Hoare, was the sister of the third president of Harvard, Leonard Hoare. From Edmund's marriage to Joanna came a son, Daniel. From Daniel, the Quincy-Adams relationship sprung forth. From Edmund's marriage to Elizabeth Elliot came another son, Edmund, who furthered the Edmund Josiah branches of the family that initiated two practices followed by successive generations of Quincy's: sending a son to Harvard and naming a son either Edmund, Josiah, or John without a middle name. John Quincy's father, the aforementioned Daniel Quincy, was a Boston goldsmith, then considered to be a banker, who died when John was a year old. Later at Harvard, John had a noticeably good record and in his senior year received funds from the Sprague Legacy. After commencing in 1708, he returned to Harvard for another year as Scholar of the House. John Quincy inherited from his maternal grandmother that portion of the original Mount Wollaston land grant that his maternal great-grandfather, William Ting, had purchased. After Harvard, John Quincy succeeded his uncle Judge Edmund Quincy in the command of the Suffolk militia. John Quincy was appointed a justice in 1715 and sent to the House of Representatives in 1717. For 2 generations, he served church and town faithfully, being moderator at 42 town meetings. A marked distinction was paid by his elevation to His Majesty's Council, in which he served 9 years, a period that included some of the most trying episodes of the provincial era. In 1726, the General Court appointed him trustee of the funds of the Ponkapog Indians. The Indians had been given a land grant in Stoughton, but their white neighbors almost immediately began annexing their meadows, orchards, and timberlands. In their distress, the Indians petitioned the legislature for John Quincy as guardian. For 20 years, he served as their legal representative, going so far to allow the tribe to encamp on his farm when smallpox devastated their numbers. In 1729, John Quincy began 12 successive years as Speaker of the House and was frequently appointed to important committees by the Patriot majority. The most important element in the career of John Quincy was his firm attitude and the rising antagonism between the people and the royal governors. As Speaker, it was he who voiced the people's aspiration and presented to the governor their sturdy rejection of oppressive measures. All that John Adams, Sam Adams, and James Otis spouted in the next generation, John Quincy was now saying face to face with officials especially appointed by the Crown to exact submission. The sparks were already flying that were to light the blaze of the Stamp Act some 20 years in the future. In the spring of 1758, John Quincy left the General Court and retired to Mount Wollaston, where he came as close to anyone as being a major influence upon young John Adams. John Quincy was the maternal grandfather of Abigail Smith, who became the wife of John Adams. On July 12, 1767, as John Quincy lay dying, his day-old great-grandson was baptized by the Reverend John Hancock. The infant was christened John Quincy at a service in the Hancock parsonage. The following day, John Quincy died. John Quincy Adams later made note of his christened name, stating, "It was filial tenderness that gave the name. It was the name of one passing from earth to immortality. These have been the strongest links of my attachment to the name Quincy, and have been to me through life a perpetual admonition to do nothing unworthy of it." John Quincy was kept steadily in offices of great responsibility by the suffrage of his fellow citizens because his presence guaranteed integrity. He was considered to be the civic father of the Braintree community, and when Braintree's North Precinct was incorporated as a separate town in 1792, it was named in his honor. The Quincy family's 19th century annals, even in summary, must begin with an ending that had reverberations. In the fall of 1801, John Quincy's only son, Norton, died without issue. At his departure, Norton's great estate passed to several nieces and their families, including Abigail Adams. Her husband, John, who had a covetous eye for nearby real estate, moved quickly to enlarge Abigail's share by buying up the shares of others. And so a substantial part of this Quincy estate became the property of 19th century Adamses. When John Adams met Abigail Smith in 1759, the 22-year-old Harvard graduate had recently returned from keeping school and studying law in Worcester to establish a law practice in Braintree. He had little but his own talents and his education to help him. A conflict between determination and self-doubt was to remain central in John Adams's character through most of his life, the source of not only torment to him, but also of history's fascination with his ultimate achievements. It may not be much to say that these opposing forces would have pulled him apart and destroyed him if he had not encountered Abigail Smith. Except by hindsight, one can find little in the background of this remarkable young woman to suggest the place she would win in history. But Abigail herself declared that, like other American girls, she suffered from being denied educational opportunities. A self-taught reader and writer, what she learned from her father's books, in which Lawyer Adams contributed from the time they first met, was lively and literate, and thus began an intellectual as well as emotional courtship that would be bookmarked in time. Perhaps this underlies why Abigail Adams has been remembered as one of the first advocates of equal rights for women. But her highest family pride rested with grandfather Quincy and the knowledge she was directly descended from one of the oldest families in Britain. It was a pride she imparted to each of her children to distinguish her lineage from those of her husbands. That is why, in 1841, when John Quincy Adams won his argument in the Supreme Court that led to the release of the Africans taken in the Amistad, Adams told his son, "The signature and seal of Sire de Quincy to the old parchment were, with a clear conscience, almost my only support and encouragement under the pressure of a burden upon my thought that I wished to plead for more, much more, than my own life." For more than a century, the Quincy family had experienced a steady accumulation of wealth and influence in the Bay Colony. Respectability, a willingness to serve in public office, and the ability to do so effectively helped in capitalizing on the economic benefits that often went with such positions. Even in the highly unstable society of colonial Massachusetts, where fortunes and reputations could be lost on the turning of the evening tide, by the 1730s, the Quincys had achieved the appearance of permanence by their badges of honor and their colonial prominence. Destiny thus decided that the Quincy name should be continued by a third Edmund who was born in Braintree. As a student at Harvard, he was a brilliant youth who by his sophomore year had more than 100 books in his own library. He also inherited his father's estate while at Harvard. After leaving Harvard, Edmund settled in Braintree, where he married Dorothy Flint, the sister of the famous Harvard tutor Henry Flint. Edmund ascended to the rank of colonel in the Suffolk militia at a time when the county of Suffolk included what is now the county of Norfolk, as well as the town of Boston. In 1706, he began to enlarge the house and also extended the improvements to the surrounding landscape. For his wife's brother, Harvard tutor Flint, and confirmed bachelor, he built a two-story addition by the brook. His final touch was to name the estate the Dorothy Quincy Homestead for his daughter. Among other judicial positions, he served as Justice of the Superior Court of Judicature for 19 years and maintained an unblemished reputation. In 1737, Edmund was elected a commissioner by the General Court and sent to Great Britain to settle a controversy over the boundary line between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. While in England, Judge Quincy was inoculated against smallpox, but a month later succumbed to the disease and died. He was buried in Bun Hill Fields, where a monument was erected to his memory by the Bay Colony. The fourth Edmund was born in his father's homestead in Braintree and attended Boston Latin School, where he befriended schoolmate Benjamin Franklin. Upon entering Harvard, grand-uncle Judge Samuel Sewall selected a choice room for him. Edmund married Elizabeth Wendell and later went into the import business with his brother, the first Josiah. By 1737, the business had become so successful that their brother-in-law, Edward Jackson, was taken into the firm, and the mercantile company was renamed Quincy, Quincy & Jackson. This part I love. By 1748, Quincy, Quincy & Jackson owned a ship named the Bethel, which had been on a voyage to the Mediterranean. At the time, England was at war with France and Spain, which the colonists distinguished as King George's War, and Spanish privateers were especially dreaded by the English commerce. Although armed, 6 of her 20 guns were wooden. Not long after sailing through the Straits of Gibraltar, the Bethel fell in, just at sunset, with a ship of superior force flying Spanish colors. Escape was impossible. Instead of attempting it, de Bethel bore down upon the Jesus, Maria, and Joseph and commanded her to surrender. The captain of the Bethel made a display of lanterns in the rigging and had all the sailors' spare coats and hats propped by sacks of grain with broomsticks and mop handles, seemingly to be muskets, so as to make the Spaniards believe, when silhouetted by the setting sun, that the ship was full of armed men. The Spanish captain mistook Bethel for an English sloop of war, struck his colors, and gave up his ship without firing a shot. His rage and that of the crew upon discovering the ruse to which they had fallen victim was unavailing. Before cutting the Jesus loose, the Bethel crew relieved it of 161 chests of gold and silver. This amounted to more than 300,000 pounds, making the partners of Quincy, and Jackson among the richest men in the colonies. Edmund preferred to be called Squire Quincy just to distinguish himself from the numerous colonel, judges, and justices in the family, even though he had been appointed justice of the Court of Common Pleas. Around 1750, he began spending more time at the ancestral mansion in Braintree after the Bethel incident. Benjamin Franklin was a frequent visitor to his farm. At Braintree, Edmund also became a moderator at a town meeting. 5 years later, he dropped out of town affairs after losing most of his money to highly speculative ventures. The final blow came when the council advised the governor to issue a commission of bankruptcy against him. All of the household goods from his Boston and Braintree homes were auctioned off, along with his extensive library, which was good enough to justify a catalog. By 1762, the Dorothy Quincy homestead was sold, and the house of the Edmunds in Braintree was no more. Now living in Boston, he was regularly elected to public offices. On the night of the Boston Massacre, he was one of the 3 presiding justices at Faneuil Hall for the arraignment of Captain Preston and the soldiers accused of firing upon the citizens. From 1767 onward, he was generally in sympathy with the Patriot movement, and by 1773 he was publicly denounced as no friend of the government because he had allowed a defendant, a patriot, to post bail, and the man escaped to Maine. Justice Benjamin Gridley quarreled so bitterly with him over his policy of bailing all patriots brought before him that Gridley had to resort to public threats in order to get, as reported in the Boston Gazette, one of the damned Sons of Liberty to jail. Edmund's profound wisdom gave credence to his insightful correspondence during this period because he took each of the steps of the road to the Revolution several jumps ahead of the rebel colonists. By the spring of 1773, he was writing about the rising political storm as the event which may finally be the glory of America. By the fall of 1774, he was calling for war, and the following spring was rejoicing in the prospects of a clash. On April 27, 1775, Edmund Quincy was forced to flee Boston. The Redcoats were searching for John Hancock and learned that Edmund's daughter, Dorothy, was engaged to Hancock. That August, John Hancock became his son-in-law. When Generals Washington, Lee, and Knox came to take command of the army at Cambridge, Edmund rode as their escort. Edmund spent much of the Revolutionary War moving from town to town, a hunted man by the British for his open views against the Empire and the suspicion that he was harboring Hancock. After the war, he returned to Boston, but his house had been burned to the ground. He lived with his granddaughter and resumed his practice of special justice. He died, still active as a justice, on July 4th, 1788. The first Josiah was sent to Harvard, where he was a disorderly student and rebellious child, despite the fact that Uncle Henry Flint kept an eye on him. He graduated with the class of 1728, but refused to appear in person to receive the second degree of Master of Arts. Josiah married Hannah Sturgis and spent most of the time sailing the high seas for his firm Quincy, and Jackson. In Boston, Josiah's mansion and gardens extended back to join those of his brother Edmund's house on Summer Street. Josiah Quincy had already inherited 200 acres at Mount Wollaston when he decided to return to his native town after the Bethel incident. Instead of building on this land, he purchased the Hancock parsonage. Now retired from the shipping business altogether, by 1750, Josiah became a country gentleman. He established a glass factory, which was said to be the first in America. The factory flourished until it was destroyed by the British during the Revolution. During this period, both Quincy houses teemed with young people, boy and girl cousins, and they attracted other young people. When John Adams reproached himself in his diary for gallanting or hustling girls instead of reading law, he usually meant that he had been spending too much time at Josiah or Edmund's house with daughters Hannah's or Dorothy and one or more of their sisters or cousins. In 1754, Josiah Quincy was elected to the House of Representatives and became a colonel in his father's old militia regiment. In 1757, he was appointed justice and 5 years later placed on the quorum. But there was also tragedy. His wife died unexpectedly in August of 1755, and his home in the Hancock parsonage burned to the ground. Tragedy struck again when his oldest son died at sea and his second home burned. Josiah then built a handsome mansion which then stood in the country commanding a view of Boston Harbor. The house still stands today at 20 Muirhead Street in Quincy, but when Josiah lived there, he was tormented for the rest of his life of it too burning down. Josiah was a member of the Sons of Liberty, and it was he who developed the idea of building small sailing vessels to dodge and fight among the islands of Boston Harbor. He sold his idea to the Patriot leaders, but General Washington, who by now had become a personal friend, gently explained that there was not enough cannon to arm such boats. From the windows of his mansion, he observed the movements of the British fleet and reported personally to Washington. His joy at the evacuation of Boston was lyrical. After the war was shifted away from Boston with the arrival of the French fleet, Josiah was provided with new contacts. He dined on the French flagship and entertained the officers in the parlor of his mansion. When the Massachusetts courts reopened, Josiah became active again as a justice. As early as April 1776, he was urging Franklin's support of a strong central government. He lived long enough to receive from Franklin a letter stating, "The definitive treaty has been signed. We are now friends with England and with all of mankind. May we never see another war, for in my opinion there was never a good war or a bad peace." Colonel Josiah Quincy died in 1784. The mansion and farm was left to his grandson, but his family and furnishings were not extensive, mostly due to the loss of books and other items from 2 house fires. The first Samuel Quincy attended Harvard, where his record was good, except for the incident when he and classmate John Hancock got a Negro slave intoxicated, and both were publicly admonished. At commencement, he pronounced the valedictory address of his class. It was no surprise when he and friend John Adams were admitted to the Suffolk Bar in November 1758 and admitted to practice before the Superior Court 3 years later. But it came as a complete shock when Samuel first appeared in the barrister's habit in August of 1762. Although Samuel preceded his cousin Jonathan Sewell as Solicitor General, it was Samuel's younger brother Josiah Jr. who quickly rose to prominence. This natural disappointment in the older brother may have been exploited by the Loyalists who swayed him away from the Patriot cause. However, it is more likely that Samuel became a Loyalist simply because he relished the social splendor that accompanied Crown appointments. At the time of the Boston Massacre, Samuel was serving as Solicitor General, in which he was assistant to his cousin, now Attorney General Sewell. It was Sewell's duty to prosecute the soldiers on behalf of the Crown, but he was so ill that Samuel was left to present the cases. In the spring of 1775, Samuel fled to England with a choice collection of Loyalists after the incident at Lexington Green. For the past year, his wife, Hannah Hill, had been telling him that it was high time for him to turn around and begin taking sides with the Patriots, but he explained his decision to leave by simply telling her, "I am but a passenger and must follow the fortunes of the day." During the siege of Boston, his house had been occupied by Burgoyne, whose cooks had used the mahogany tables as chopping blocks. At the evacuation, a mob plundered what remained. The news that he had been proscribed by the Massachusetts Act of October 16, 1778 was the culminating blow. In 1779, his real estate was confiscated and sold at auction. He bitterly protested that he had done nothing to deserve such treatment and bemoaned the loss of his library as the most mortifying stroke. His great desire, he still protested, was to live quietly in New England, send his sons to Harvard, and be a benefactor to that college. Since this seemed hopelessly out of the question, he sailed to Antigua in 1780 and took an oath as barrister. Samuel had always enjoyed the climate of the West Indies, but a decade later, his failing eyesight, digestive woes, and gout convinced him that he should seek a change. He became seriously ill on the voyage back to England and died en route. He was buried among his exile friends in Bristol. The second Josiah, who liked to be referred to as Josiah Quincy Jr., has also been called the Patriot. Josiah Jr. graduated from Harvard, and upon receiving his Master's of Arts, he delivered an English oration, the second to be given in the vernacular at a Harvard commencement, on the subject of liberty, or as others remembered it, patriotism. It was an oration that held the audience enraptured and was often referred to for the next 60 years. While still an undergraduate, Josiah Jr. had been taking notes on the cases argued at the Superior Court, and after earning his second degree, he entered into the office of Oxenbridge Thatcher to read law and was admitted to the Suffolk Bar. He was admitted to the Suffolk Bar in 1766 and 2 years later began to practice before the Superior Court. Josiah Jr. married into the prestigious Phillips family and actively associated with many colonial dissenters. His political writings that first appeared in the Boston Gazette in October 1767 were filled with patriotic fervor. He threw himself into the revolutionary cause with such oratorical skills that John Adams named him the Boston Cicero. Josiah Quincy Jr. was 26 years old when he and John Adams were personally engaged by Captain Thomas Preston for defense against the charge of murder in the Boston Massacre. In October 1770, Preston's case came to trial at the Superior Court, followed in November for the implicated soldiers. During both trials, the brilliant defense by Josiah Jr. and John Adams saved the lives of Captain Preston and the soldiers who were acquitted. Soon after the trial, Josiah Jr. became one of the first to appeal to his countrymen to take up arms against Mother England. Such actions did not go unnoticed, and he was brought into the inner patriot circle of the radical high command. His worsening consumption continued to weaken his already frail body. Thus, his appointment to the Committee of Correspondence warranted a voyage to South Carolina. So, in February 1773, under orders from Dr. Joseph Warren, he sailed south for the winter. Once there, he became appalled at the treatment of slaves and astounded to be told by fellow lawyers that stealing a slave was punishable by death, but the most wanton killing of one was punished only with a minor fine. He thought that the South Carolina laws and legal decisions regarding the rights of slaves was a human disgrace. By 1773, he was back in Boston, once again caught up in the political excitement. In the autumn of 1774, the Boston Whigs sent him to England to meet with the Friends of America in the hopes of settling differences with England peacefully. Josiah Jr. met with the Friends of Liberty, but came away convinced that American freedom would have to be bought with blood. By the end of the year, he began spitting up his own blood from violent coughing attacks and proposed sailing directly to Philadelphia to address the Continental Congress if the American acts were not repealed. His health was rapidly declining, and the Whig politicians urged him instead to return to Boston with a message that could not be entrusted to the mail. During the month-long passage, his health, worsened by the wetness and cold while crossing the Atlantic, proved fatal. When the Boston packet made Gloucester Harbor on April 25, 1775, it was clear Josiah Jr. would not live to be carried ashore. He died with the physicians and the Gloucester selectmen standing helplessly by in his cabin, and the secret message died with him. The selectmen tried in vain to reach his family, but his father had fled Braintree. After the battle at Lexington, his wife Abigail left Boston for her father's house in Connecticut with her 3-year-old son. It was weeks before she received the news of her husband's death and traveled to Braintree alone in search of her father-in-law. On arriving, she discovered the Quincy families had scattered because there was an alarm the British soldiers were en route to raid Braintree. Instead, she took refuge with Abigail Adams at the foot of Penn's Hill. Josiah Quincy Jr. was laid in the Gloucester Harbor Parish Cemetery. When his wife Abigail died in 1798, they were reunited in the Braintree Cemetery by their son. The Gilbert Stuart portrait of the Patriot that was painted long after his death but declared by those who knew him with his slender face and cocked eye, to be an excellent likeness of this brilliant young man. Currently, Harvard Law School is preparing a 4-volume dissertation funded by the Colonial Society of America on his legal reports. Their study will bring to light the legal significance of Josiah Jr.'s contribution to the rebel cause and American independence. The authors of the Harvard Law School report have concluded that, had Josiah Jr. lived, there is no doubt whatsoever in their minds that he would have become the first Chief Justice of the United States. After the death of his father, the third Josiah Quincy's mother, Abigail, began the practice of submersing her 3-year-old son into a tub of frigid water pumped directly from the well. She believed that a daily cold water bath would invigorate the child's immune system and prolong his life. She must have been correct, because for the next 90 years, this Josiah strictly adhered to the daily ritual of taking a cold water bath. Josiah followed his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather into Harvard, where he graduated first in his class. As a young lawyer, he rose rapidly in the ranks of the Federalist Party. After a term in the Massachusetts Senate, he was elected to Congress and served until 1813. Returning to Massachusetts that year, Josiah was sent to the Massachusetts House of Representatives and elected Speaker. His reputation as a humanist and advocate for the poor became widespread, and he later sought a judgeship where he could address the plight of Boston paupers. In 1823, Josiah was elected Boston's second mayor and became perhaps the most successful urban reformer in early 19th century America. His administration widened, straightened, and cleaned the city streets for the first time in 2 centuries. With the completion of Faneuil Hall Market, the mayor oversaw a successful urban renewal project, one of the first of its kind. He also constructed new penal institutions and established a new fire department that ultimately lowered citywide insurance rates. Mayor Quincy purchased lands called the Rope Walk lands that are presently the site of the Boston Public Gardens. He also initiated the massive effort to provide pure water to the city by creating the Public Water Works Project. To his contemporaries, Josiah Quincy became known as the Great Mayor. For a short time, he considered running for governor, but a greater challenge awaited him at Harvard. By 1829, the prospects for the country's premier college appear dismal in contrast to those envisioned by its founders. There was financial insolvency, declining enrollment, deteriorating faculty morale, rampant student rebellion, and a lack of alumni support. The Board of Overseers selected Josiah Quincy as Harvard's 15th president, and he accepted the position as an extension of his public service. His vision for Harvard's future enabled him to oversee the erection of Dane Hall, Harvard's first law school, 4 other major buildings, and a new college observatory. He also shrewdly acquired property around the college perimeters. These acquisitions permanently added 9 additional acres to the campus of Harvard Yard. President Quincy spent 7 years compiling the history of Harvard, a 2-volume dissertation that was the first effort to recall Harvard's history spanning 2 centuries. While researching the college's records, he discovered the college's motto, Christo et Ecclesiae, Latin for Christ in the Church, had been supplanted in 1693 to commemorate a strong theological relationship between Harvard and the Congregational Church. In an effort to sever this former connection, President Quincy revived the original founding motto, Veritas, upon the shield of the college crest in time for the 1836 bicentennial celebration. A year after the History of Harvard was published, the first formal meeting of the Harvard Alumni Association was convened in response to the historical significance portrayed in President Quincy's book. Later, President Eliot attributed the success of the Harvard Alumni Association to Harvard's first history as the catalyst that propelled the Harvard Alumni Association into the organized force that continues to this day to excel beyond every other alumni association in America. By the time he retired in 1845, Harvard University was left financially solvent with a new set of standards for academic excellence. After an extraordinary long life, Josiah Quincy died in 1864. He was given one of the largest funeral processions in Boston history, and his death was reported in newspapers throughout New England and New York. The New York Daily Tribune eulogized him as the patriarch of all public men in America. But of all the fitting tributes bestowed upon Josiah Quincy, none is more significant than the homage of calling one of Boston's most enduring landmarks Quincy Market. Eliza Susan Quincy was the official chronicler of the Quincy family history for most of her adult life. During her father's long public career, Eliza Susan was brought into contact with many remarkable people of 19th century society. She never came before the public as an individual authority, but the large number of her private manuscripts, as well as various family papers furnished to Harvard in private historical repositories, would fill several volumes. A natural gift for drawing, many proofs exist, not only of the Quincy and Adams's estates, but renditions of early Boston, Braintree, and Harvard during the early to mid 19th century. Having passed her declining years in the ancestral mansion, she died in January 1884 in the room where her great-grandfather passed in 1784, a century having spanned the period between the two deaths. The fourth Josiah graduated from Harvard and was chosen class valedictorian over Ralph Waldo Emerson. After being admitted to the Massachusetts bar, he became an officer in the Boston Light Infantry and aide-de-camp to Governor Levi Lincoln. It was during this time that he escorted Marquis de Lafayette on his triumphant return to America with a cavalcade of 1,200 militia horsemen. In 1833, he escorted President Andrew Jackson on his historic tour of Massachusetts in the same fashion. One of his earliest recollections was his father's whispered counsel to take note of an elderly gentleman in a nearby pew at church. "Remember that man," the child was told, "as he is John Adams, once President of the United States, and may not be with us long." So the boy made a point of dining with John and Abigail Adams and read to the old gentleman during the last 5 summers of Adams's life. In his sophomore year at Harvard, Josiah began a journal in which he recorded his impressions of John Adams and of other giants of the times. He was to continue this practice for the next 60 years. As Boston's 11th mayor, he reorganized the police force into its present union and filled and sold the marshlands of South Bay to help defray the cost of the municipal waterworks project. He oversaw the erection of Charles Street Jail and introduced female teachers into the public school system. The Josiah Quincy Elementary School in Boston is named for him. But he is most remembered as the mayor who first brought water into the city. Initiated by his father in 1825, Mayor Quincy took up the project and constructed the Cochituate supply system, which brought water to every street in Boston. On October 25, 1848, when the project was completed, a 100-gun salute at sunrise heralded the day, with church bells clanging their own salutes. Buildings were festooned with bunting, and 14,000 people gathered on Boston Common. Amid the celebration, Mayor Quincy opened a gate that spewed a column of sparkling water some 80 feet up into the air and down into a shallow pool, later named Frog Pond. Harvard classmate Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote of Mayor Quincy, "He has written his name in water, yet it will last forever. The people of Boston have never found him dry, and he has taken care that they shall never be so." After retiring from public service, he was in great demand as a public speaker. The Boston Gazette said of him, "He was not only eloquent but witty, and for years the life and center of intellectual converse in the city." At the personal request of Charles Dickens, Josiah presided over the public festival honoring the famous author when he came to Boston. Now in his 70s, he further appeared before the legislature with pleas for a cooperative savings and loan system for the working man. After 2 years of appeals, the legislature approved of his bill, which became law in 1877, and the first cooperative bank in Boston became a reality that summer. He finally retired to his home in Braintree, but his sprightly mind sparkled even in his old age with reminiscences of younger days. The articles he wrote during this time, which appeared in the New York Independent, were afterward collected and published under the title Figures of the Past and released a year after his death. His own boyhood philosophy sums him up best. The majority of mankind pursue excellence merely because they love excellence. The fifth Edmund Quincy of the family said of the family name, "My family has always been prominent, and I was expected to keep up the credit of the race." Edmund graduated from Harvard and Harvard Law School. It was Edmund who once said of Harvard students, "A Harvard man knows who he is. If he isn't a Harvard man, who is he?" Although he became a lawyer, journalist, lecturer, and author of successful fiction, for most of his life, Edmund was unfulfilled, drifting along with no political agenda. Then one day, while researching the life of his grandfather, Josiah Jr. the Patriot, he discovered his law reports at Harvard, which dealt extensively with the slavery issue nearly a century earlier. With the tempest of the Garrison wing of the abolitionist movement rising, Edmund threw himself into the cause with such zeal that up through the end of the Civil War, he was writing as many as 3 articles a day for journals throughout the country. Charles Francis Adams once wrote of Edmund, "From that date, he stood forth an altered being. He found he had work to do, and he faithfully performed it." It is interesting to note the progress of the anti-slavery movement beginning by a blind assault upon the public opinion of the country and all its leading exponents, and gradually settling into shape until the strong old edifice came down by application of brute force. Since this was written by a conservative who took years to reach the ground Edmund arrived at overnight, it is a remarkable compliment and admission. It is also another reminder of what was accomplished in America by courageous dissent. Looking at the unbroken line of Josiah's, there comes one who disrupted it, by name and public service. The fifth Josiah was christened in the family tradition without a middle name. As a young man, he actually appealed to the legislature after his parents denied his request to be given a middle name. By an act of the General Court, he was granted permission to legally adopt his great-grandmother's maiden name, Phillips, partly to distinguish himself from his forebears of that name, and partly because his brother Samuel was christened with their mother's maiden name. He chose to be different by namesake. It was the first instance that a Josiah or an Edmund or even a John Quincy had a middle name inserted between that of the christened and family name. Josiah Phillips was a graduate of Harvard Law School, and was admitted to the Massachusetts bar, but he never practiced. Instead, he turned to poetry, writing short stories, and transcendentalism. Although Josiah Phillips had collaborated with his uncle Edmund in anti-slavery journalism, his political beliefs were thoroughly conservative. Military and public service was left to his brother, Samuel Miller Quincy. The second Samuel graduated from Harvard and Harvard Law School. After Samuel Miller was admitted to the Massachusetts bar, he edited the monthly Law Reporter and served as president of the Board of Examiners. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he enlisted in the Union Army as captain and rose to the rank of colonel. During the war, he was assigned to the 73rd United States Color Regiment. He was wounded and captured at 2nd Manassas. He was imprisoned for a year and later exchanged. At the war's end, he served as acting mayor of New Orleans and was breveted Brigadier General of Volunteers. He returned to Boston and was elected city alderman. He also practiced law, wrote on legal subjects, and helped found the Bostonian Society. Having never fully recovered from his wounds and the experience as a Confederate prisoner, he died a bachelor in 1887. The sixth Josiah was educated at Harvard, where he won the Bowdoin Prize for his dissertation and the Boylston Prize of elocution. He attended Harvard Law School and was admitted to the Massachusetts bar. He was first elected to the state legislature, where he carried out a program to modernize Massachusetts labor law. When Josiah served as President Grover Cleveland's Assistant Secretary of State in 1893, his Harvard classmate Theodore Roosevelt commented, "A fine employment for a Quincy, fine indeed." Josiah carried his blend of political realism into the mayor's office in 1895. At that time, political realism meant making alliances with the reigning Irish ward bosses. Josiah was glad to work with the bosses as long as they supported his program to make the city a better place to live, particularly for those who lived in the slums. This meant playgrounds, swimming pools, improved sanitation and housing, better labor conditions, and pay for city workers. By the spring of 1896, Mayor Quincy had built 18 public bathhouses and 2 freshwater swimming pools. By the summer of 1898, instructors were hired to teach 4,000 children to swim. The East Boston Athletic Association became the first indoor municipal gymnasium. Children were also allowed to swim in Frog Pond on Boston Common for the first time. Imaginatively recycling city-owned properties, Josiah won approval from the state legislature in 1898 to create 22 playgrounds alongside 22 new schools throughout the city. His playground idea was so novel and so well received that 12 more were opened the following year. The East Boston Tunnel and the Commonwealth Pier were started during Mayor Quincy's administration, as was the South Station Railway Terminal. But perhaps Mayor Quincy's greatest satisfaction occurred on September 1st, 1897, when he presided at the grand opening of the first subway system in America. After Josiah left the mayor's office in 1899, he continued to remain close to Boston's internal affairs and served on several commissions. In his role as head of the newly created Transit Commission, he was responsible for 2 new subway stops, Arlington Street and Copley Square stations. In 1919, Josiah succumbed to a lengthy illness. He was eulogized as a descendant of thinkers and dreamers who made our republic possible. On September 4th, 1833, President Quincy left his office at Harvard College the one time during his 16-year term he was away from the university. He was driven from Cambridge to his Mount Wollaston farm to celebrate the bicentennial anniversary of Puritan Edmund Quincy's emigration to America. The Quincys of that day assembled in the rear parlor of his mansion overlooking Boston Harbor and gave thanks for being permitted to stand after the lapse of 2 centuries on that spot selected by their ancestor. Those present vowed honor to the past, gratitude to the present, and fidelity to the future. Their hope was that 100 years later, extended family members would reunite at the same place to mark the 300th anniversary. It was not meant to be. On a cold December day in 1890, Charles Francis Adams II rode from his house on President's Hill to Mount Wollaston to visit one Miss Abigail Phillips Quincy, one of the last residents of the old mansion. Within the past year or 2, he later wrote of his visit, the old patrimonial place has been sold, all except the old house and some half-dozen acres about it. The farm has been cut into house lots, which are hawked about by the vulgarest kind of speculators. The broad, straight avenue with its 6 rows of trees, all planted by her father, has been graded and turned into a public street. Poor, cheap houses are being built under the eaves of this old grand mansion. Before long, the sprawl of suburbia drove many of the Quincys from the place where they had been rooted since the founding of Massachusetts. Soon, the only reminders of their existence were a few old houses, a number of place names, and of course, the name of the city itself. By 1933, the remaining acreage of both the Dorothy Quincy and Josiah Quincy homesteads had been reduced to about 2 acres and was no longer even owned or cared for a Quincy family member. Around both houses, much of the original farmlands had been built up with dense neighborhoods. Many of the extended Quincy family branches had either ceased or migrated around the country or to Europe. Those who remained in the Boston area were living 20th century modern lives or were enduring the pains of the Great Depression. It would not be until the late 1970s, around the time the Quincy Market was reopened as a tourist destination, that a new generation of Quincy's living in the greater Boston would open the old journals in an effort to bring the family's past back to life. Now, standing before you this evening, looking back over the past 370 years to when my family's emigration to America first took root, I am honored to relate that there was a time when there was a Quincy male who represented by his generation a family who in every succeeding generation gave themselves to the public cause. For nearly 3 centuries, this pride of lions has distinguished the Quincy name by serving either town, city, or state. For me, it is much more than pride to learn that so many good deeds and examples of the fathers were emulated by the sons. Undoubtedly, it was a good omen for the early republic to witness such a long line of one family who deserved well of their country. Thank you.
I think we have time for just a couple of questions, and then we're going to go to the book signing. I'm going to walk around with a handheld microphone so we can all hear.
I'm a Quincy resident, and first off, I wanted to say that it's not that bad. I mean, at least your homes are still there, and they are themselves. They have nice green, and the houses around them aren't that bad, and so forth and so on, and we appreciate them being there. And we are trying to get them into the National Park Service. I don't know if you know that.
Well, I'm working on the Dorothy Quincy homestead with Congressman Delahunt at this juncture.
Yeah, getting it into the National Historic Park with the Adamses. Second, when did they move out of the Dorothy Quincy homestead? Because I had understood that John Hancock and Dorothy Quincy got married there.
No, they did not. No. They were on the run. They planned to. The Edmund Quincy IV, who lost all his money, fixed up the house. He brought in new wallpaper from China, and he had all these decorations. And then the war, then Lexington and Concord happened. And John Hancock, what actually happened was John Hancock and Sam Adams fled to Lexington because that's where John Hancock's father was the first minister. Dorothy and Libby, John's aunt, met them. John wanted to fight. Sam said, if you fight, we may lose one of the leading patriots. Run. And he left his wife and his aunt. And in Dorothy's journal, she talks about the musket balls hitting and splintering, through the side of the parsonage. But no, he left. Let me get this straight. He left Lexington. He went to Woburn, Worcester, and then Connecticut to his friend, the brother of Aaron Burr. I forget his first name. Dorothy caught up with him. John then went to the Continental Congress. And Aaron Burr tried to move in on Dorothy. John came running back and married her in Connecticut.
Oh, that's even better than what I thought. And really briefly, just I'm a member of the United First Parish Church, which all these folks were members of too, where the Quincy pew is next to the Adams pew. Our current building's 175 years old this year, but we're actually going to have the 13th great-grandson of the Reverend John Wheelwright, who you mentioned, the associate of Anne Hutchinson back in the 1600s as a guest minister on October 5th, if anybody wants to come, because that was interesting stuff, especially in these days about separation of church and state and church persecution, all that stuff.
The mayors, did they have legal residences in Boston, or wasn't that necessary?
Well, the first mayor, the first Josiah, he was living on Hamilton Place. So he was already living in Boston. He had the farm in Braintree, but in the winter they came into Boston, and society was in Boston. The second mayor of Josiah, he was living on Pearl Street in Boston. And then he built with Bullfinch, one of the townhouses on Park Street. So by the time he was in his second year as mayor, he moved into the townhouse on Park Street. And the third, Josiah, was living in Quincy, and not in the ancestral estate, in his own home in Quincy. And he kept an apartment in Boston. So, yeah, they were shuffling back and forth.
Yes, sir. I'm just interested in the description of your talk, and it said that an Edmund de Quincy had come from France with William the Conqueror.
Yes.
With all due respect, wouldn't that be Edmund de Quincy? It doesn't get, and nowhere here does it give the Norman French version of your family. And I believe that that was interesting to me that it was still spelled that way in this country, because I read Judge Samuel Sewell's diaries, for example, and he speaks of his wife as Mistress Quincy, Quincy.
Yeah, there's many spellings of it. It's de Quincy.
Sorry?
De Quincy.
De Quincy is
Quincy.
All right, thank you.
French, from Normandy. There is still a Quincy French town, a province in France.
Oh, how interesting. Well, of course, it's a place name. And also, I'm asking simply because I don't know, and I would be very interested, where do you find the records that the de Quincy family came with William the Conqueror? I simply don't know, and I'd be interested.
Well, what happened is this Richard Cranch, got all the records, and he made note of it. The problem is, when you get back into England, they were able to trace by baptism certificates. And they've got the male line traced, but they don't have all the death dates. They have the baptism dates. And the father who legally baptized them in what church, all the way back. But they're at Quincy Historical right now.
Quincy Historical
Yes.
Society?
Right, yeah.
Oh, thank you. So maybe I should go and look there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
15 years ago, a historian by the name of H. Hawley Hobart confirmed everything. And there's also a descendant of that Sewell line, a professor in Ontario, Canada, who has double confirmed it as well. You can go online and look up de Quincy, and he's got the whole thing, all spelled out.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you again, John.
All right.
Very interesting presentation.
Let me ask all of you a question, okay? Let me tell you about writing a book, okay? You hear about people writing books and they get rejected, and they can't, well, I had the luck to be accepted, but with conditions of having it all rewritten and things. Once you get published, it's like selling your soul. They come at you and they say, we want another one. See, get to work on it right away. Anything. Think of something. And they call you and they say, what are you working on? Well, they came up with this idea. They said, well, why don't we do this? My question to you as an audience is, I'm doing what's called a treatment for PBS, which is an expanded version of this. This is, 20 pages, 30 pages. The treatment will be 500 pages. My question is, as an audience, do you think that PBS should be seriously interested in something like this? Okay, that's great. Because I will tell you, when I started the research, I started at the Harvard Archives. And the people at the Harvard Archives, who know me very well by now, said to me, we think that this is such a good idea that we will assign you students. And we will think about giving them credit if the research goes into such detail. And then the Harvard Law School people got wind of this thing and had me out there. And they said, we could do one whole show on Josiah Quincy Jr. because, and you women will get a kick out of this. He was so distraught when he went south, not only over the slave issue, but in the South at the time, A man married a woman with a license to own a slave, and the word Negro was crossed out, and the word wife was written in as his property. He brought that back up here, and he just said, you know, even the rights of women at that time, which was way ahead of its time, 100 years ahead of its time. And that's why they are doing this dissertation, because they said he has things that are 2 centuries ahead of their time. So they were very excited, very excited. Don't ask me. Don't even try to. I can't figure it out. I come down from an Edmund, the last Edmund. That's all I know.